Hello Ed, this is Brian Ryo with the current final for networking. I am asking for an extension since I've run into a few issues right now. But the things that I do have, I'll show in a quick demonstration. So what ends up happening here in the very beginning is I start up the game, and what the game tries to do is it tries to become a client that is shown on this side. So we first attempt to be a client, and then we try to connect. While we try to connect, we basically just pull this loop over and over and over again and see if we get a response from the server. If there's no response, we create the server, and on creation of the server, we shut down our socket and our port. We process that information so that way it's official that we're off, and then we configure so that way we at that point become the server. So this one on this current side is the server, and this one on this side will end up becoming the client. So as you can see, right now we've connected, and right here we've connected. We have a roundabout time of about 2 milliseconds. I don't have the luxury of 2 computers, but here I have this just connected locally. By Friday, I should be able to type in an IP address. But anyways, it's only at this moment when both clients are connected that if you press the space bar, you enter the actual game. So on this would be player 2. Player 2 cannot control player 1's movement, but player 2 can control their own. As you can see, I'm across the server. The important thing is that player 2 has no physics, and what I end up doing, I'll explain a little bit more in detail, but all I do is send the positional values for these sprites, and I set those XY coordinates so that way the sprite moves on the screen. So one issue that I have right now is that bullets fire, but they don't register collisions. So as you can see, this bullet has not been marked for deletion, so they just stay on the screen. I'll fire on this side. As you can see, I fire, but the bullets stay there. Since the bullets aren't destroyed, they're recycled. Their information is passed along through here. So if I try to fire again, there's still the same blue ones on here. So the bullets do fire in the correct position. They make contact with the wall. But for some reason, I still don't have it set for this bullet to be marked for removal. I'm sure it's a quick fix, but that's going to have to be fixed by Friday. I'll terminate the server so you can see that while I'm not receiving any information, this side cannot update because there's no physics. I'll close out of that, and I've mentioned how I switch from server to client. I'll go into some of examples of my data-driven format. So right here, my current types are the ship. Client ship data is the X and Y positions when updating the position for the client. The game state, we need that information so we can add points and enter the actual play scene. We have a fence hit, we have a missile, and a missile hit. This missile hit currently is not working, but I'll go into it later. We have a queue header, sequence numbers, queue type, and data. And we have a server process. So depending on the type, we will call p ships in this case, or we will call a game manager to change the state, p ship again to change the position. On a fence hit, we have an array of fences, and the number right here will be called to do work. So in this case, to register a collision when a fence has been hit, and we have one for missile as well. but that's this is for the X and Y position of the missiles, so that way we can update it. That's what the do work is for. We have the ability, we have accessors, we have setters and getters for our P ships and our fences, as well as all of our private, or all of our things here. We have our ship in queue, our ship client in queue, and one for each one of the types, queue types that I mentioned above. But that covers the in queue. Apart from, in order to receive those messages, our network manager can process messages, and right around here, depending on the type, we read the memory. It's very important to read the memory correctly, since I've made a ton of mistakes, and I think this is where the biggest issue for taking in, I think this is the biggest issue for why my X and Y positions have been a complete mess, because you need to make sure that this matches almost exactly on the output queue. And moving into the output queue, we have a push to client, so we send, this is something that the server calls to push the X and Y positions of our ships and our missiles to the client, so that way we make sure that they're both running as close to sync as possible. And since this side doesn't have a physics simulation running when it is the client. But apart from that, we send this information across the channel. This other output queue, or this other output call, will send basically all the physics information to the server, so that way the server knows if the game state has changed on one side, if a ship has applied a thrust, or has modified its angle, or completed an action such as firing a missile or shooting. We have a fence hit, so when a fence hit occurs on this side, we'll send that information back to the player. We have a missile hit, which currently isn't working. This would just register the missile's collision, but like I said, at least on the client side, the missile moves, and as soon as it hits an object, it stops and gets removed from, and doesn't get removed from my list. So this is the one section that I need to work more on. Just like in the input manager, we have all our output queues that are here. I have a queue manager to make things simpler, and in order to maintain everything, it is a singleton. Briefly looking at my ship takes ship rotation, move, fire, and mine types, so that way I can send that ship information through. So if I need to fire something, I just say, fire, here's the value, here's the ship number, mine, I've moved, I've rotated, etc. The client information is a little bit bigger, but that's because the ship needs some of this additional information. I send all of this all together, but it may be a better choice to do it in this way, to send individual packets of smaller data. But I kind of like the idea of all this being passed through all at once, instead of calling as down here for the client, to send all the information at once, so I can set the physical position and the angle on screen for the client side. I also have, I've also moved fire missile and use and laymine to here when it used to be in the game objects, the game manager. It just makes more sense that a ship is in charge of firing a missile and laying a mine rather than the game manager. But that's just a simple little switch. Here is the do work for when I receive information from a client into the server. So I call move on the actual physics information, rotate, fire missile, and lay mine. So that way my occurrences on here on the server are accurate to those on the client. Missile, as I mentioned before, we have our state, we have our missile number, our position XY, and our angle. This is only needed once. So we send this chunk of information as soon as a missile is fired, so that way the client can label that missile number. It can take the X and Y values and the angle, and just calculate the launch of that missile being shot. But again, as I mentioned, we register fence hits, but for some reason, my on hit isn't called for my bullet, but I think it just needs some little tweaking. Mine has the lay mine and armed mine states, but that's something else. I can quickly go into my game manager. My game manager basically just locks out one of these two states in terms of the update. So if you're player one, and that's set if you're the client or the server, you will do this. You will only control player one's inputs and send that information across the channel. If you're player two, the same thing occurs, but in reverse. And this just basically happens because you don't want to send extra information that really isn't important, because the in queue of player two will basically trigger this information in the in queue. And plus, if anything modifies the physics, it will be sent over to physics simulation anyways, and it will be sent back to the client, because the client doesn't have physics per se. Some minor changes in terms of the draw. Player 1 and player 2 don't have to be drawn because they've already been added to our game objects list. But those are just some minor changes. But anyways, Ed, that covers everything that's been done so far. As I mentioned, missiles are just a little bit picky right now, but I think I should be able to solve that hopefully by tomorrow and be done by everything on Friday. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks so much for the extension.